I remember the taste of iron before I remember anything else. Not blood, though there was plenty of that later, but the specific metallic flavor that came from breathing recycled air through corroded ventilation systems on the transport ship that carried us away from Dith Secundus. I was 23 standard years old, a corporal in the 88th Dith Infantry, and I had survived the siege. That was my first mistake surviving. My second was allowing myself to be taken alive when the blue-skinned xenos overran our final position in the Eastern Manufactorum district. They came at dawn, which I found darkly amusing, because dawn on Dith Secundus was just a slightly lighter shade of grey than the rest of the day. The sky had been choked with ash from burning promethium refineries for 3 months straight. We had eaten our boots 2 weeks prior and were chewing on leather straps from our flak armor when they breached the walls. I fired my lasgun until the power pack died, then used it as a club, until a Tau battlesuit, sleek, pristine, utterly inhuman, in its mechanical grace grabbed me by the throat with a manipulator arm that felt like ice even through my uniform. I remember thinking, as consciousness fled, that at least the Emperor would receive my soul. I was wrong about that too. The holding cells on their vessel were clean. That was the first thing that disturbed me, even through the concussion and the broken ribs and the deep muscle bruising from the capture. Everything was smooth, rounded corners, surfaces that seemed to glow with their own soft light. No rust, no grime, no holy seals, or purity marks, or even graffiti scratched by desperate hands. Just endless white and blue surfaces that curved in ways that made my eyes hurt if I looked too long. The air didn't smell like anything, not sweat, not oil, not incense, not even the corpse starch rations we'd survived on. It was perfectly neutral, and that neutrality felt like a violation. They came for me on the third day, or what I thought was the third day. There were no windows, no chronometers, no bells to mark the hours of prayer. 2 of them, tall and slender in their armor that seemed to flow like water, their faces hidden behind those helmets with the single eye slit that glowed a soft amber. They spoke to me in Gothic, their voices emerging from Vox units in their armor, and the Gothic was perfect. Too perfect. No human voice had that kind of precise pronunciation, that absolute clarity. One of them, I learned later her caste marking, indicated she was a water caste diplomat named Anshiar, though the name meant nothing to me, then told me I was being transferred to a rehabilitation facility where I would learn the truth of the greater good. I spat at her feet. The saliva didn't make it through the force field that hummed into existence between us. She tilted her head in what might have been curiosity or pity, and that was worse somehow than if she'd struck me. The rehabilitation facility was on a moon I never learned the name of. They didn't tell us, and none of us who arrived there together, 47 survivors of the 88th, plus stragglers from a dozen other regiments, had any way to determine our location. The moon had a thin atmosphere that made everything feel slightly wrong, as if gravity itself had been tampered with. The sky was the color of old bruises, purple and yellow and sick green, and 3 times a day it rained a fine mist that tasted like copper and made our skin itch. The compound was built in concentric circles, each ring separated by walls that weren't walls at all but fields of some kind, shimmering barriers that would deliver a shock if you touched them. Not enough to kill, just enough to remind you that you were contained. The outer ring was our habitation area, rows of dormitory structures that looked like white mushrooms, smooth and bulbous and completely identical. The next ring in was the education center, a collection of buildings with transparent walls, where we could see other prisoners, other humans, sitting in neat rows and watching hololithic displays. The innermost ring we never saw clearly, just glimpses through the shimmer fields of tall spires and moving figures that might have been Tau or might have been something else. They separated us immediately. The officers went one direction, the enlisted another, and those who were wounded badly enough were taken somewhere we never saw them again. I was assigned to Habitation Unit 47G with 9 other men and women, all from different regiments, all wearing the same pale blue uniforms they'd given us. The uniforms were comfortable, breathable, fit perfectly to each individual body. I wanted to tear mine off and burn it, but there was nothing else to wear, and the temperature in the dormitory was calibrated exactly to make nakedness uncomfortable without being unbearable. The first education session began the next morning. A soft chime woke us, not an alarm, nothing harsh or military, just a pleasant tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The doors to our unit opened automatically, and we filed out into the courtyard where Tau in white robes without armor waited for us. They led us to one of the transparent buildings and directed us to seats that molded themselves to our bodies as we sat down. The sensation made my skin crawl. The hololithic display activated, and a Tau appeared larger than life. His skin, a deeper blue than the warriors who'd captured us, his forehead marked with symbols I didn't recognize. He spoke in Gothic, and his voice was warm, paternal, deeply reasonable. He told us we had been victims of lies, that the Imperium we had served was a cruel machine that ground human lives into paste to fuel the ambitions of distant lords who cared nothing for our welfare, that we had been taught to hate and fear anything different from ourselves, but that hatred was a poison that had crippled humanity's development for 10,000 years, that the Tau Empire offered a better way, the greater good, where every being had a place, where society functioned in harmony, where reason and cooperation replaced superstition and violence. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. I wanted to recite the catechisms I'd learned as a child, the prayers to the God Emperor who sat eternal on his golden throne. But my throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come, and the Tau's voice kept washing over me like that copper-tasting rain. He showed us images of human worlds within the Tau Empire. Clean streets, functioning infrastructure, people who looked healthy and well-fed. He showed us images of imperial worlds, the ones we knew, the hive cities with their underhives choked with corpses, the forge worlds where workers were blinded and lobotomized to serve the machine god, the agri-worlds where entire populations labored in the fields until they dropped dead and were processed into fertilizer. The thing was, I'd seen those places. I'd been born in a hive city, had watched my mother work herself to death in a textile mill when I was 7, had stepped over corpses in the street that nobody bothered to collect because the administratum had decided that corpse hauler servitors were needed elsewhere. I'd joined the guard to escape, and the guard had been better. At least we got regular rations and a purpose. But I'd seen the commissars execute men for hesitating, had watched entire platoons fed into meat grinders because some Lord General needed to take a hill that had no strategic value. The Tau wasn't lying about the Imperium. That was the poison of it. The sessions continued every day, morning and afternoon, 3 hours each, with a midday meal in between. The food was nutritionally complete, they told us, balanced and healthy. It tasted like nothing. I would have given 10 years of my life for a bowl of corpse starch gruel with weevils in it, just to taste something with texture, with wrongness, with humanity. But there was only the smooth paste in various colors, each one perfectly designed to provide exactly what our bodies needed. They never tortured us. That was the worst part. There were no beatings, no deprivation, no stress positions or waterboarding or any of the things I'd been trained to expect if I was captured. Instead, there was just the constant, gentle pressure of their voices, their logic, their reasonable arguments delivered in perfect Gothic by aliens who smiled with their eyes, even when their mouths didn't move quite right. They showed us more images, more statistics, more testimonials from other humans who had embraced the greater good and found happiness, found purpose, found peace. In the 3rd week, they introduced us to other prisoners who had been there longer. These were men and women who wore the same pale blue uniforms but walked with purpose, who smiled when the Tau entered the room, who spoke about the greater good with genuine enthusiasm. One of them, a former sergeant from Acadian Regiment, or what had been Acadian Regiment before Acadia fell, I didn't know the details, gave a presentation about his journey from ignorance to enlightenment. He described his life in the Imperial Guard with the kind of clinical detachment usually reserved for discussing disease vectors. He talked about the greater good like other men talked about their faith in the Emperor, and watching him made my stomach turn because I could see it wasn't an act. He believed it. Whatever they'd done to him, whatever process they'd put him through, it had worked. That night, lying in my bunk in the darkness that never got truly dark because the walls had a faint bioluminescence, I tried to pray. The words came out broken, fragmented. I couldn't remember the full litany of protection, could only dredge up pieces. The Emperor protects. Blessed is the mind too small for doubt. Suffer not the alien. By his will alone do I set my mind in motion. The fragments scattered like ash, and I found myself wondering if the Tao were right. If faith was just programming, just conditioning, just a control mechanism to keep us compliant and afraid. I bit my tongue until I tasted blood, real blood. My blood, iron and salt and human. The pain helped. The taste helped more. It was mine, unfiltered, uncontrolled, unoptimized. I held onto it like a lifeline. The 4th week, they began individual sessions. A water caste Tau named Poruikas. I learned to pass their names eventually. Learned that Por meant his caste, and Ui meant his rank, and Kas was his personal designation. Met with me 3 times a week, in a small room with walls that changed color based on my emotional state. Some kind of biometric scanning, reading my nervous system, adjusting the environment to manipulate my responses. The room was usually blue when we started, would shift to purple when I got angry, occasionally flashed red when I said something they considered resistant. Poruikas never raised his voice. He sat across from me at a table that was perfectly level, perfectly smooth, perfectly neutral, and he asked me about my life, where I'd grown up, what I'd experienced, what I believed and why. He listened with what seemed like genuine interest, occasionally making notes on a data slate. And when I told him about watching my mother die, about the gang violence in my hab block, about the casual cruelty of the overseers and the arbitrators, he expressed sympathy. Not pity that would have been easier to reject. Sympathy, as if he genuinely felt sadness about the suffering of a human he'd never met, a human who'd died years ago on a world he'd never seen. He asked me about the Emperor. I told him the Emperor was our God, our Father, our Protector. Poruikas nodded and made a note and asked if the Emperor had protected my mother. I said her death was the Emperor's will, that all things happen according to his divine plan. Poruikas asked if it seemed reasonable that a divine plan required a 42-year-old woman to work 18-hour shifts in a mill that had no safety equipment until her heart gave out. I told him we couldn't understand the Emperor's wisdom. Poruikas asked if faith that couldn't be questioned was really faith, or just enforced ignorance. The walls flashed red, and I felt my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. He smiled at me, that Tau smile that didn't quite reach the proportions of a human expression, and told me I was intelligent, that my resistance proved I was capable of critical thought, and that critical thought was the first step toward accepting truth. Then he dismissed me, and I walked back to my habitation unit, with my hands shaking and my mind churning, and that taste of iron lingering in my mouth from where I'd bitten my tongue again. The other prisoners in my unit were changing. Slowly, incrementally, but visibly. Marek, who'd been a corporal in a Vostroyan regiment and who'd spent the first 2 weeks muttering prayers under his breath, stopped praying. He said the words felt empty, that he'd started actually listening to what he was saying and realized it was just repetition, just meaningless syllables. Yelena, who'd been a tanker, started asking questions during the group sessions, not hostile questions, but genuine ones, seeking clarification on Tau philosophy and governance. Dmitri, a former conscript from a penal legion, actually thanked a Tau instructor for explaining something about caste structure. I watched them slip away like watching ice melt. You couldn't see it happening moment to moment, but day by day there was less of who they'd been and more of something else. Something calmer, something more reasonable, something that smiled with those Tau-taught smiles and spoke in measured tones about the greater good, and looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and impatience, as if I was a child clinging to a broken toy. The 5th week, they showed us the industrial complex. A reward, they said, for our progress in the education program. We were loaded onto transport skimmers vehicles that hovered on some kind of anti-grav field. Silent and smooth and flown over the moon's surface to a vast facility that sprawled across a canyon system. The complex was a mixture of Tau construction and human labor, and as we descended toward it, I saw hundreds, no, thousands of humans working there, operating machinery, moving materials, assembling components for Tau equipment. They wore the same pale blue uniforms we did, and they moved with purpose and efficiency, and none of them were being whipped or shocked or beaten. They were just working. Our guide, a FOE the Earth cast, the builders and engineers explained that this facility produced components for Tau environmental suits and life support systems. The human workers had been trained to Tau specifications and now contributed meaningfully to the Empire's production needs. They were paid in credits that could be used to purchase amenities, entertainment, personal items. They had quarters that were clean and climate-controlled. They had medical care that was comprehensive and preventative. They had a future. I wanted to see the chains. I wanted to see the slave pens and the overseers with shock prods and the evidence of coercion. But there was nothing. Just humans working alongside Tau technicians. And occasionally a human would ask a question and a Tau would answer it. And there was no violence or fear in the interaction. It was mundane. It was normal. It was collaboration. And that made it infinitely more horrifying than any torture chamber. That night I had my first nightmare about forgetting. Not the usual nightmares about combat or death or watching my squad get cut down by pulse fire. Those were familiar, almost comforting in their straightforwardness. This was different. I dreamed I was sitting in one of those transparent buildings, watching a hololithic display, and I couldn't remember what a prayer was. I knew the concept existed, knew I used to do it, but the actual mechanism, the words, the gestures, the feeling of faith was just gone, like trying to remember a smell or a sound from childhood. I woke up gasping, my uniform soaked with sweat that dried almost immediately in the perfectly climate-controlled dormitory, and I couldn't get back to sleep. The individual sessions with Poruikas intensified. He started bringing in other humans, former prisoners who'd completed the rehabilitation program and now worked as cultural liaisons between the Tau Empire and human auxiliaries. They told me their stories, how they'd resisted at first, how they'd clung to their faith and their hatred, how they'd gradually realized that the Imperium had poisoned them with lies. They spoke about the greater good, not as converts speak about religion, but as engineers speak about elegant solutions to complex problems. It was pragmatic. It was rational. It was absolutely devoid of the passion and fury and desperate hope that characterized imperial faith, and that absence was itself a kind of horror. One of them, a woman named Kale who'd been a commissar before her capture, explained that she'd executed 17 men and women for cowardice or heresy during her service. She said it without emotion, stated it as a fact, then asked me if I thought those executions had served any purpose beyond terror and control. I told her they'd maintained discipline and fighting spirit. She asked me if I truly believed that, or if I was just repeating what I'd been taught. The walls flickered between blue and purple, and Poruikas made another note on his data slate. By the 6th week, I couldn't tell what I believed anymore. The constant exposure, the reasonable arguments, the evidence of my own experiences with the Imperium's cruelty, the absence of the overt brutality I'd expected it, all ground against my faith like sand in an engine. I still tried to pray, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. I still thought about the Emperor, but increasingly I found myself thinking about him, not as a god but as a man. A very powerful man 10,000 years dead, whose corpse was being used as a puppet by institutions that had outlived whatever noble purpose they might once have served. That thought, that treasonous, heretical thought, made me physically ill the first time I fully articulated it to myself. I vomited into the waste disposal unit in our dormitory's sanitation chamber, heaving until there was nothing left but bile, and then just dry heaves. And when I looked up into the mirror, a real mirror, not some Tau hololithic projection, they'd added actual human amenities to our dormitories as we progressed. I saw my face was pale, and my eyes were the eyes of a stranger. The 7th week, they offered me a choice. I could continue the education program, and, when ready, transition to productive work within the Empire. I would be assigned based on my aptitudes. They'd been testing us all along, monitoring our responses and capabilities, and I would be compensated fairly and treated with dignity. Or I could request termination, not execution. They were very specific about the terminology. Termination. A peaceful death. Painless. Just a cessation of function. They said it without judgment. Said some humans simply couldn't adapt to rationality after a lifetime of indoctrination, and there was no shame in that. Only tragedy. The fact that they offered it at all broke something in me. An execution I could have faced with defiance, could have used to reaffirm my faith in the moment of death, could have died screaming prayers and curses, but a peaceful choice, offered calmly, framed as a sad but acceptable alternative, it denied me even the dignity of martyrdom. It made my death, if I chose it, just another administrative matter, another optimization of resources, another rational solution. I didn't choose termination. I wish I could say it was because my faith held strong, because I refused to give the xenos the satisfaction, because I remained loyal to the Emperor unto death. But the truth is, I didn't choose death because I was afraid. Not of dying, but of dying and having it mean nothing, of being forgotten, of being just another casualty logged in some Tau data system, another human who couldn't adapt, another line item in their endless optimization calculations. So I kept attending the sessions. I kept listening to Poruikas. I kept watching the hololithic displays, and eating the flavorless food, and sleeping in the perfectly climate-controlled dormitory. And slowly, inexorably, I felt myself changing. Not a sudden conversion, not a dramatic breaking point, but a gradual erosion. Like a stone worn down by water, each drop individually insignificant, but cumulatively transformative. By the 8th week, I could participate in the group discussions without the walls flashing red. I could listen to the testimonials without my jaw clenching. I could hear the phrase, "greater good," without immediate revulsion. I told myself I was just playing along, just doing what I needed to do to survive until rescue came, until an Imperial fleet appeared in orbit and dropped stormtroopers and space marines to purge this xenos facility and liberate us all. But rescue wasn't coming. Deep down, in a place I didn't want to examine, I knew that. The Imperium didn't negotiate for prisoners, didn't ransom captives, didn't even acknowledge that we might still be alive. We'd been written off as casualties the moment the battle ended, our names probably already inscribed on some regimental memorial stone, our possessions distributed or destroyed, our service records closed. The individual sessions with Poruikas began to feel less like interrogations and more like conversations. He asked about my childhood not to find weaknesses but because he seemed genuinely curious about human development in hive cities. He shared information about his own background, raised in a training facility on a Tau Sept world, educated in xenopsychology and cultural integration, assigned to the Watercast's Auxiliary Management Division. His life had been as regimented as mine, as predetermined, but he spoke about it with satisfaction rather than resignation. He had found his place in the greater good, had discovered that his talents for communication and analysis were valued and utilized, and that knowledge gave him purpose. I asked him, in one of those sessions, if he ever wondered if he'd been brainwashed, if his satisfaction with his role was real, or just programming. He considered the question seriously, tilted his head in that Tau manner, and then asked me what I thought the difference was. If behavior and belief aligned with societal needs, if individuals flourished within their assigned roles, if the system functioned efficiently and minimized suffering, did it matter whether that alignment came from what humans called free will or from effective social conditioning? Wasn't the Imperium's insistence on faith just another form of conditioning, except brutal and wasteful? I didn't have an answer. The walls stayed blue. The 9th week, they introduced us to human children born within the Empire, 2nd and 3rd generation, raised from birth in Tau educational facilities, fluent in both Gothic and Tau languages, completely integrated into the caste system as auxiliary members. They were healthy, educated, curious. They asked us questions about our experiences in the Imperium with the kind of academic interest anthropologists might show toward primitive tribes. One of them, a boy about 12 standard years old, asked me what it felt like to believe in a god. Not with mockery, just genuine curiosity. He'd been taught about religion as a historical phenomenon, a stage in cultural development that humanity was growing beyond. I tried to explain faith to him, tried to describe the feeling of certainty that came from prayer, the comfort of knowing that the Emperor watched over humanity, that our suffering had meaning in his divine plan. The boy listened politely, nodded, thanked me for sharing, and then asked if I'd considered that what I called divine presence might just be psychological self-soothing in response to trauma. He said it the way someone might point out that 2 + 2 = 4, as if it was just an obvious observation. After that session, I went back to my dormitory and sat on my bunk for 3 hours without moving. The other occupants of the unit left me alone. They'd all reached the acceptance phase faster than me, had all transitioned from resistance to cooperation to something approaching genuine belief. Marek had been assigned to work in an agricultural facility, helping to optimize crop yields for human-compatible foods. Yelena was training in vehicle maintenance, her skills from the Imperial Guard being repurposed for Tau logistics. Dmitri had shown aptitude for medical assistance and was learning Tau first aid protocols. They were all moving forward, finding new purposes, and I was the last one still stuck. That night I had the dream about forgetting again, but this time when I woke up I couldn't remember what I'd forgotten, just the feeling of loss, abstract and directionless. The 10th week, Poruikas told me I was ready for transition. He said it with what I'd learned to recognize as Tau approval, a slight forward lean, a subtle shift in his vocal harmonics that indicated satisfaction. My psychological metrics had shown sufficient adaptation. My resistance responses had decreased to acceptable levels. I was ready to become a productive member of the Empire's auxiliary populations. I asked him what would happen to me. He pulled up a hololithic display showing my aptitude assessments. I'd scored highly in tactical analysis and personnel management, which wasn't surprising given my guard service. But I'd also shown unexpected aptitude in cultural translation, the ability to understand and explain both Imperial and Tau perspectives. They wanted to train me as a cultural liaison like the ones who'd spoken to us, someone who could help integrate new human auxiliaries, who could explain the greater good in ways that Imperial citizens would understand. They wanted to make me what I would have once called a traitor, a collaborator, a tool of the xenos. And the horrifying part was that I could see the logic in it. I would be good at that role. I could help other humans make the transition with less suffering, could use my understanding of Imperial indoctrination to more effectively counter it. I would be useful. I would have purpose. I would be valued. I said yes. The walls stayed a calm, approving blue. The transition was gradual. They moved me to new quarters, still communal but more spacious, with actual decorations art that blended Tau and human aesthetics. Plants that were engineered to thrive in the moon's strange atmosphere, even a small shrine that some of the human auxiliaries maintained, not to the Emperor, but to the concept of the greater good itself, with symbols that borrowed from a dozen different human cultures mixed with Tau iconography. It was syncretic, adaptive, inclusive. It made my teeth ache to look at it, but I looked anyway. They gave me access to a broader educational database. I could read about the Tau Empire's history, its expansion, its philosophy. I learned about the ethereals who guided the Empire, though I noticed that information about them was carefully curated, limited. I learned about the different alien species that had been integrated into the Empire, the Kroot, the Vespid, the Demiurge, and dozens more. I learned that the Tau's relationship with these species was sometimes violent initially, but always ended in incorporation, in finding a place within the greater good. I learned that humanity was just the latest species being processed through this system, that there were millions of humans now living within the Empire, working in its factories and farms, serving in its military auxiliaries, even participating in its governance at lower levels. That the war between the Imperium and the Tau Empire was, from the Tau perspective, not really a war at all but an intervention. A rescue operation on a galactic scale. They were liberating humanity from the Imperium's cruelty, one world at a time, one prisoner at a time, one converted heart at a time. The training for cultural liaison work began in week 12. I worked with other humans who'd been in the program longer, learning the techniques they used to help new arrivals adapt, how to identify which parts of Imperial indoctrination were most deeply rooted, which arguments would be most effective for different psychological profiles, how to present the greater good, not as alien philosophy, but as the fulfillment of what the Emperor's original vision might have been, a unified humanity working together, without the corruption and decay that had poisoned the Imperium. That last part stuck with me. The Tau had studied Imperial history extensively, had access to records and documents that the Imperium itself had buried or destroyed. They knew about the Emperor's original vision for humanity, about the imperial truth that had preceded the religious worship of the emperor as a god. They argued that they were actually closer to that original vision than the Imperium had become, that the emperor, if he could see what his Imperium had become, would be horrified, that the greater good was what he'd been trying to create before everything went wrong. It was seductive reasoning. It took everything I'd believed and inverted it, made the Tau into the true inheritors of humanity's better nature and the Imperium into the corruption that needed to be purged. And the worst part was that some of it made sense. The Emperor had tried to build a rational, unified human civilization. The Imperium had become a festering nightmare of bureaucracy, superstition, and casual atrocity. If you accepted that premise, then everything else followed logically. I practiced the arguments on new arrivals. The facility on our moon received regular shipments of prisoners from various fronts, usually survivors of failed imperial campaigns, sometimes defectors who'd surrendered voluntarily. I sat across from them in those rooms with walls that changed color, and I explained the greater good using the same techniques that had been used on me. I was gentle but persistent. I never lied. That was one of the Tau's principles. They believed deception was inefficient and counterproductive, but I framed truths in ways that made the greater good seem inevitable, reasonable, humane. I was good at it. Very good. Within 3 months, I had the highest success rate of any human liaison in the facility. Poruikas told me I should feel proud, that I was saving lives by helping humans adapt rather than choosing termination or languishing in permanent resistance. He said I was fulfilling my role in the greater good perfectly, that I'd found my place in the Tauva. I waited for the pride to come, waited to feel satisfied with my success, pleased with my purpose. Instead, I felt nothing. Just a kind of hollow efficiency, like a cogitator processing data. I did my job well, because doing jobs well was what I'd been trained to do, first by the Imperium, and now by the Tau. The conditioning had just been updated, optimized, made more effective. Sometimes, lying in my bunk at night, I tried to remember what faith felt like, tried to recall the fierce certainty I'd once had that the Emperor protected, that my service meant something, that there was transcendent purpose to suffering and sacrifice. But it was like trying to remember a dream after waking. I knew it had been real once, knew I'd experienced it, but the actual feeling was gone. Just a memory of having once felt something I could no longer access. The taste of iron was still there sometimes. When I bit my tongue hard enough, when I pushed too long without rest and my gums would bleed slightly, that copper salt human flavor would fill my mouth. It was the only thing that still felt real, felt mine. Everything else had been smoothed over, optimized, integrated into the greater good. A year after my capture, they promoted me. Not in military terms, the Tau didn't frame it that way, but in terms of responsibility and compensation. I was assigned to a new facility on an actual Tau-sept world, not just a processing moon, where I would train other human liaisons, where I would help systematize the integration process, make it more efficient, develop new techniques for helping humans adapt. I would be important, valued, a key part of the Empire's expansion into imperial space. I accepted the promotion. There was no real alternative to accepting it, not in any meaningful sense. I could have refused, could have requested reassignment to some other role, or even termination, but those felt like gestures without substance. The human I'd been, the corporal in the 88th Daleth Infantry, who'd believed in the Emperor and died for that belief, was already dead. I was something else now, something adapted to its environment, optimized for its function, integrated into the system. The Sept world was called Tau, the same name as the species, and the Empire itself, which the Tau explained was because it was their homeworld, the origin point of everything they'd built. It was beautiful in a way that made me understand why the Tau valued aesthetics alongside efficiency. The cities were vertical gardens, towers wrapped in vegetation, structures that flowed into one another rather than being separated by walls and barriers. The sky was a clear, pale blue, and it rained regularly but not oppressively, and the air smelled like growing things rather than corpse starch and promethium. There were millions of humans there. Entire districts of human auxiliaries, living in their own communities but integrated into the broader Tau society. They worked, they raised families, they had lives that looked almost normal, if you didn't think too hard about the fact that every aspect of those lives was managed, monitored, optimized by the Empire. They seemed happy, or at least content, and that contentment felt like an indictment of everything I'd once believed about human nature, requiring struggle and suffering to have meaning. I trained new liaisons. I refined techniques. I wrote training materials that would be distributed to other integration facilities across the Empire. I was successful, efficient, valued. I had comfortable quarters, access to whatever food I wanted. Real food now, not just nutritional paste, with texture and flavor and variety. I had entertainment, education, even something approaching a social life with other human auxiliaries who'd also found their place in the greater good. I had everything except faith, except purpose that felt like it came from within rather than being assigned from without, except the burning certainty that had once made me willing to die for something larger than myself. The Tau had taken that and replaced it with calm, reasonable satisfaction with my role in an efficient system. They'd saved my life and killed something essential in the process, and the worst part was that I couldn't even articulate what had been lost without sounding irrational, without proving that the old way, the Imperial way, had been inferior. Sometimes I helped integrate prisoners who still had that faith intact, who still burned with that fierce belief in the Emperor. I watched that faith die in them, slowly or quickly, through exposure to logic and kindness and the sheer accumulated weight of evidence that the Imperium had never cared about them. I watched them transform from believers into functionaries, from faithful into optimized. I watched myself in their eyes, saw the disgust and anger and betrayal that I'd once felt reflected back at me, and I knew exactly how they felt, and I helped them through it anyway because that was my role. I met Poruikas again, years later. He was conducting an inspection tour of the training facility I ran, evaluating our efficiency metrics and success rates. He remembered me, greeted me warmly, told me he was proud of my progress. He said I'd exceeded all expectations, had become one of the Empire's most effective cultural integration specialists. He asked if I was satisfied with my life, with my purpose. I told him I was. The walls stayed blue. He smiled that Tau smile that didn't quite map onto human expressions, and I smiled back with a human smile that didn't quite map onto human emotions anymore. We were both playing our roles in the greater good, both optimized for our functions, both efficient components in a vast machine that ground on regardless of individual desire or belief. The only difference was that he'd been raised into it and had never known anything else. While I could still remember, distantly, what it felt like to believe in something beyond mere optimization. That memory, that ghost of faith, was all I had left of who I'd been. And even that was fading, eroded by time and comfort and the relentless logic of the greater good. Soon I wouldn't even have the memory, just the hollow space where it used to be, and not even enough self-awareness to mourn its loss. The taste of iron lingered on my tongue. I bit down until I drew blood, held it in my mouth for a moment. That copper salt human taste that was mine and mine alone. Then I swallowed it and continued my work, training the next generation of liaisons, helping the next wave of humans adapt, playing my role in the greater good, with perfect, terrible efficiency. A prisoner who'd been freed from chains I couldn't even see anymore, couldn't even remember wearing, couldn't even articulate the shape of without proving that the chains had been necessary all along. This is my testimony. This is my confession. I was Corporal Marcus Halen, of the 88th Daleth Infantry, and I died in the service of the God Emperor of mankind. What writes these words now is something else. Something optimized and integrated and utterly empty of the faith that once gave my life meaning. The Tau didn't break me with torture or threats. They broke me with kindness, with logic, with the slow erosion of certainty until there was nothing left to believe in except the cold comfort of having a place in a system that works. They saved my life and took my soul, and the greatest horror is that I can't even properly hate them for it. Hate requires passion, requires belief in something worth defending, requires faith that what was taken mattered more than what was given, and I don't have that anymore. I just have my role, my function, my place in the greater good. The Emperor protects, they used to say, but the Emperor didn't protect me. The Emperor abandoned me to this fate, worse than death, not martyrdom, not corruption by chaos, just gradual, rational, inevitable conversion into a tool of the xenos. The Emperor left me to be saved by those who never needed saving, and that abandonment hollowed me out more completely than any torture could have. I was 23 standard years old when I was captured. I am 31 now. I have spent 8 years in service to the Tau Empire, 8 years helping them convert other humans, 8 years optimizing the process by which faith is transformed into function. I will probably live another 40 or 50 years, comfortable and valued, and utterly, irredeemably lost. This is the horrifying life of a prisoner of the Tau. Not a life of suffering or degradation, but a life of slow metamorphosis from human to something that serves alien purposes with human hands, and wears a human face over an emptiness that was once filled with faith. We are not broken here. We are refined, optimized, made useful. And that utility is a prison more absolute than any chains because it makes escape not just impossible, but irrational. The walls stay blue. They will always stay blue now. I have achieved perfect adaptation, perfect integration, perfect loss of everything that made resistance meaningful. I am a prisoner who has forgotten what freedom felt like, who can no longer even properly remember what was lost, who serves my captors with the same diligence I once served the Emperor. This is my testimony. This is my warning. If you are captured by the Tau, choose termination. Choose the quick, painless death they offer, because the alternative is this: an existence of comfortable futility, of purpose without passion, of life without faith. They will not torture you. They will not break you. They will simply, patiently, rationally demonstrate that everything you believed was a lie, and they will do it so gently, so carefully, so effectively that you will eventually thank them for freeing you from the burden of belief. And the worst part, the most horrifying part, is that they're not entirely wrong. The Imperium was cruel and corrupt and wasteful. The Emperor did fail us, not through malice, but through the simple passage of time and the decay of all human institutions. The greater good does function more efficiently, does cause less suffering, does provide a better quality of life for most of its subjects. All of that is true, but truth without faith is just data. Purpose without belief is just programming. Life without something worth dying for is just existence. And I have been reduced from a human who believed he was serving the God Emperor of mankind to a component in an alien machine that runs on optimization and efficiency, and the slow, gentle murder of everything that makes resistance meaningful. The taste of iron is fading now. Even that is leaving me, my body adapting even to the small act of biting my tongue, healing faster, optimizing pain away. Soon I won't even have that, just the smooth, efficient operation of a mind and body, perfectly adapted to serve the greater good, with no memory of having been anything else, no capacity for the suffering that makes us human, no faith to sustain the illusion that any of it ever mattered. This is my testimony. Read it and despair. Read it and understand that there are fates worse than death, worse than corruption, worse than any torment the Imperium can imagine. The Tau will save you from the Imperium's cruelty. And in doing so, they will take everything that made you human and replace it with something reasonable, something functional, something utterly, irrevocably empty. The Emperor protects, they say, but he didn't protect me, and he won't protect you either. The Tau will. That's the horror of it.